In the months leading up to the invasion of Europe, a quiet revolution unfolded inside American training camps. Far from the beaches, tanks, and artillery that would soon define the war, there was no thunder of guns here, no clash of steel, only the crackle of radio static drifting between rows of soldiers kneeling in the grass, practicing words that would soon guide entire battles. It was the sound of the SCR-300, a weapon with no barrel, no muzzle flash, no recoil, yet destined to reshape the face of modern warfare. The SCR-300 weighed just over 30 pounds, a rectangular pack slung over a soldier's shoulders with a flexible antenna rising above his helmet. At first glance, it looked too simple, too small to matter in a war filled with tanks, heavy bombers, and artillery. But appearances hid its true power. The SCR-300 gave a single infantry squad the ability to speak instantly across miles, to call for support, coordinate movement, or adjust fire in the time it took to inhale. This was unheard of in 1943. It was a violation of every assumption the Germans held about how fast an army could move. American officers who saw early demonstrations of the SCR-300 realized immediately that it was not a convenience, it was a weapon, a force multiplier disguised as a backpack. Because for the first time in history, a squad leader could speak directly to a platoon commander. A platoon could reach a company, a forward observer could summon artillery in seconds, and an infantry group pinned down in hedgerows could call tanks or aircraft without sending a runner sprinting through machine gun fire. The technology was new, barely tested, but its implications were enormous. Until then, battlefield communication for most armies still lived in the age of wire lines, flags, whistles, and shouted orders. The German army relied heavily on field telephones, wire networks, and messengers. Their radios existed, but they were large, delicate, limited in range, and often reserved for higher command levels. A German infantry platoon might go an entire fight without speaking to its supporting artillery except through slow, indirect channels. American squads, by contrast, were about to enter a war connected by an invisible nervous system. The SCR-300 was born from American engineering, driven by the need to streamline communication across chaotic battlefields. The engineers at Motorola and the Signal Corps crafted a device that could survive mud, rain, shock, and the screaming confusion of combat. Its range of 3 to 5 miles seemed small on paper, but on a battlefield choked with forests, hedgerows, and pounds, it was enough to reach anyone who mattered. American squads trained relentlessly with the new radios, learning how to talk not just fast but clearly, how to pass coordinates, how to call in fire support, how to adjust to changing conditions in seconds. Soon they moved across training fields like one organism, swift, reactive, interconnected. German observers during later battles would write of these moments, recalling what they saw in Normandy. They moved as if one brain commanded 1,000 legs. But the roots of that shock lay here, months before the landing, when American infantry learned that their voice could summon the full weight of the United States Army. The radio opened a door into a new way of thinking about war. Before radios, the commander could influence a battle only where he physically stood. With the SCR-300, he could be everywhere at once. Orders spread like electricity across the field, turning squads into extensions of a much larger will instead of fragments acting alone. This change happened quietly and without the drama of a new tank or aircraft. It happened the first time a squad leader whispered coordinates into a handset and artillery answered within seconds. It happened every time a sergeant pressed the transmit switch and knew that someone miles away heard him clearly, even under fire. But the real impact of the SCR-300 became visible only when American forces began rehearsing for the invasion of Normandy. During large-scale exercises, the radio stitched together units that had never before been able to operate with such unity. Squads coordinated flanking maneuvers. Company commanders redirected entire lines of advance while still under simulated enemy pressure. Liaison with tanks became fluid, intuitive, immediate. The radios turned chaos into choreography. It was a kind of communication the German high command never imagined that the Allies would possess, not because the Germans lacked intelligence, but because their own doctrine assumed that infantry coordination must always lag behind the speed of battle. They believed in the natural friction of war, the fog, the breakdown of orders, the isolation of small units. They believed this because it had always been true, until now. On the eve of D-Day, the SCR-300 was distributed widely across American formations, each battalion receiving dozens of sets, each company integrating radiomen directly into their structure, and each squad learning that their voice was now a weapon as vital as their rifle. The Germans prepared to defend Normandy with minefields, with machine guns, and with pre-registered artillery lines. They fortified villages, hedgerows, and coastlines, but they did not prepare for an enemy whose squads could coordinate faster than their entire battalions could react. They expected courage, they expected determination, They expected the overwhelming material power of the United States, but they did not expect that the Americans would fight as a single interconnected organism, capable of adjusting with stunning speed. The silent revolution of the SCR-300 was almost invisible to those who did not understand it. Yet in the dark hours before the assault, its antennae rose like thin spears above American helmets, ready to transmit the messages that would break German defenses not through brute strength, but through precision timing and a unity of movement no army had ever achieved. The radios hummed, the static whispered, and somewhere far across the channel, German commanders unaware of what had changed prepared their defenses against an enemy they still believed they could understand. They had no idea that the Americans were about to fight the war at a speed Germany had never seen, and that speed would come from a 30-pound box carried quietly on the back of a single soldier.
The invasion of Normandy began in chaos. Wind, rain, tide, and fire crashing together in a single violent dawn. But through all the noise, through all the confusion, a quiet thread stitched the American assault into something the Germans had never faced before. Every few seconds, somewhere on the beaches or in the hedgerows or inside the burning villages of Normandy, a click sounded on a handset and a voice cut through the storm of battle. Clear, calm, precise. It was the voice of the SCR-300, and wherever it spoke, American units moved with a speed and unity that stunned German commanders. Even on the first day, the radio changed everything. The beaches were supposed to be killing grounds, zones where units lost cohesion, where officers lost control, where small groups fought isolated and blind. That was the German expectation. It was the expectation built into their defensive plan. Separate the Americans, overwhelm them with fire, break the attack before they could form up. But the radios refused to let the Americans stay broken. The moment a squad leader crawled out of the surf, dragged himself behind a steel hedgehog, and keyed his handset, his words reached other squads, commanders, engineers, tanks, and naval gunfire teams offshore. And in those first minutes when everything seemed on the edge of disaster, those words began to pull the assault together. Across Omaha Beach, platoon leaders shouted into their handsets, requesting suppressing fire, adjusting movement, and coordinating with units they could not even see through the smoke. One squad, pinned down behind a shingle bank, called for a machine gun team 50 yards away. Another called for engineers to breach the wire. Another reached a Sherman tank commander who had just managed to get his vehicle off the landing craft and climb up the sand. The tank slewed its turret, fired a shell into a German strongpoint, and the squad ran forward. Seconds later, a different squad called the same tank, asking for smoke. The tank laid it instantly so they could cross open ground. All of this happened within a minute. German soldiers inside the concrete bunkers watched with disbelief. They had fought Americans in North Africa and Italy. They knew the Americans were brave, aggressive, well-equipped, but nothing had prepared them for this. For infantry squads that regrouped almost instantly, for platoons that shifted direction in seconds, for companies that seemed to flow around obstacles instead of breaking against them, the Germans had expected to fight units blinded by confusion. Instead, they fought a creature that adapted like water to every contour of the battlefield, moving with one will. German reports describe it again and again. They react faster than we can fire. They move before we can adjust. They fight as if connected by a single brain. The deeper the Americans pushed into Normandy, the more this became true. In the hedgerow country, the bocage slowed tanks, blocked lines of sight, trapped infantry, and turned every field into a miniature fortress, perfect for German ambush tactics. But the Americans countered with radios. The SCR-300 turned hedgerow fighting from a series of isolated skirmishes into a continuous, coordinated assault. When a squad bumped into a German machine gun nest, they did not need to retreat or wait for officers. They simply keyed the handset and gave a quick report. A second squad moved to flank. Within seconds, a mortar team adjusted its tubes. A tank on a nearby lane slewed its turret or rolled forward a few yards to fire through a gap in the hedgerow. A forward observer, several fields away, heard the call and adjusted a battery of 105mm guns to drop smoke or high explosive directly onto the German position. The coordination happened so fast that German machine gunners often died before they realized an attack had even shifted direction. A single squad leader with an SCR-300 could direct more firepower in 1 minute than an entire German company could in 10. This stunned German commanders, who still relied heavily on wired telephones and runners, and whose units often fought in fragments. Once the shooting started, they could not understand how American infantry on opposite sides of a village could converge simultaneously, or how a squad pinned in a ditch could be supported by artillery within 20 seconds, or how Sherman tanks always seemed to arrive at the exact moment they were needed. They assumed at first that the Americans had rehearsed every battle, then believed the Americans were using trickery, then finally accepted the truth. Captured documents later revealed their conclusion: American squads fight faster than our battalions because they talk faster than we can think. The radios turned every small unit into a nerve cell inside a vast battlefield nervous system. An enemy fire point would open up, the message traveled instantly across the net, units shifted, redirected, converged. The German defenders faced not squads, not platoons, not companies, but a continuously adapting force that seemed to anticipate every weakness. German officers described the sensation as fighting an enemy who saw through walls. American squads moved with such fluidity that German units found themselves outflanked without realizing they had been targeted. One report from a German colonel near St. Lo captured the shock in a single line: "Their coordination is unbelievable. We cannot react quickly enough because they have already reacted before our orders arrive." The Americans were fighting in a way no German doctrine had accounted for, not in rigid lines, not in pre-planned formations, but in a flexible, ever-changing pattern guided by constant communication. A sergeant could alter the direction of an entire platoon. A lieutenant could redirect a company without seeing them. A captain could shape the course of battle from behind a hedgerow without exposing himself. It was war conducted at the speed of speech. The SCR-300 did not make Americans braver, but it made their bravery effective. It gave shape to courage, gave timing to aggression, gave unity to movement, and in the dense hedgerows and broken villages of Normandy, that unity became a weapon stronger than any rifle or tank. German commanders would learn this lesson again and again as the campaign continued, but in the first days after D-Day, they had already understood its essence. The Americans were not winning because they had more men or more tanks. They were winning because they fought as one organism, and every breath, every step, every shot was guided by voices moving along the airwaves at the speed of command. One radio, one squad, one mind.
The bocage of Normandy was supposed to slow the Americans to a crawl. Ancient hedgerows carved the countryside into thousands of tiny fields, each bordered by earthen walls thick with roots, shrubs, and tangled branches. German doctrine viewed this terrain as perfect defensive ground. Infantry could hide anywhere, machine guns could ambush at point-blank range, and tanks found themselves trapped in narrow, sunken lanes, unable to see more than a few yards ahead. The Germans believed this terrain would equalize everything, that American numbers, tanks, and firepower would matter little inside this maze. But what the Germans did not understand was that American firepower was no longer something that had to be moved into place physically. It could be summoned instantly, simply by a voice carried through the SCR-300. The radio turned the hedgerow labyrinth into a coordinated battlefield, where fire and steel moved as fast as the man with the handset could speak, and where a single infantry squad could unleash the full might of combined arms in seconds. In the early days after D-Day, the first German units to face this new reality were stunned. They expected to face a single squad when they opened fire. Instead, within 15 seconds, a mortar round crashed into their position. Within 30 seconds, a Sherman tank appeared on their flank, guided by a short radio call. Within 45 seconds, artillery shells began landing on every corner of the hedgerow that concealed them, and within a minute, an entire platoon was shifting around their position. The Germans had never fought an army that responded this quickly, because no army had ever been able to coordinate with such speed before. The SCR-300 gave the Americans a new kind of dominance, one where information moved faster than bullets, one where a shout into a handset could bring the sky, earth, and armor down onto a target. The most dramatic example of this new power was artillery coordination. Before Normandy, artillery was powerful but slow. Adjustments took minutes, and in fast-moving battle conditions, such delays meant missed opportunities or friendly fire risks. But with the SCR-300, forward observers were able to speak directly to gun batteries with clear signal reception. They were no longer waiting behind headquarters maps. They were in the hedgerows on the front line, eyes on target. A forward observer could drop a set of coordinates into the radio. The battery, miles behind the lines, would receive the grid, calculate the firing solution, and send the first ranging round within 20 seconds. Then the observer would speak again. Adjust 50 left, fire. Adjust 20 short, fire. On target, battery fire for effect. Seconds later, entire German positions vanished under shells that hammered the earth, turning hedgerows into churned mud and collapsed bunkers into splintered wood. The speed changed everything. German units, once adept at shifting quickly between cover, now found that the moment they revealed their position, they were destroyed before they could relocate. American infantry squads took advantage of this relentlessly. And it was not only artillery. The SCR-300 connected infantry directly to armor, something the Germans rarely achieved at the same level. A squad pinned down by a machine gun nest did not have to wait for company orders. They could radio directly to a nearby Sherman tank in the next field, often only 100 yards away. The tank commander, hearing the request, would push through the hedgerow or fire through a gap in the leaves, laying high explosive shells straight onto the German gun position. American infantry advanced again, flanking the position in perfect timing with the supporting fire. German soldiers hiding behind hedgerows were shocked at how quickly armor appeared. They believed tanks could not maneuver in the bocage, yet with radios guiding them, tanks no longer stumbled blindly. They were led like hunting dogs toward precise targets. The SCR-300 also allowed infantry to communicate with mortars with an ease no army had ever achieved. Mortar teams usually operated far behind squads, but now their fire came as quickly as artillery, within moments of a call. And because the mortars were close, the rounds landed with astonishing speed. If a German machine gun or sniper revealed himself, the spotter called for a 3-round burst. The mortars answered, and the threat disappeared under exploding steel. Even more shocking for German troops was the arrival of American air power, summoned not by generals, but by men on the ground. The SCR-300 allowed forward air controllers to guide fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt into close support roles. A squad stuck in a hedgerow could request an airstrike, and within minutes the scream of a diving Thunderbolt echoed through the fields, its bombs obliterating German strongpoints. German soldiers had no equivalent capability. Their infantry could not talk to their own armor without cumbersome wire, telephone lines. And no infantryman could talk directly to the Luftwaffe. Only battalion-level officers could request air support, and even then it took hours. What the Americans did in 60 seconds often took German units half a day. While German units were still deciding how to counterattack, American infantry squads had already shaped the battlefield several times. The speed stunned German officers captured after the battle. One wrote in his post-combat interrogation, "The American infantryman does not wait. He does not hesitate. He brings fire upon us so quickly that we have no time to react." Another reported, "They use their radios as weapons. Every shot has a direction, every movement a purpose. Everything is coordinated before we understand what is happening." By July, German commanders began to realize that they were no longer fighting an army in the traditional sense. They were fighting a network, a connected system, where infantry, armor, artillery, and aircraft behaved like limbs controlled by a single brain. Field reports repeatedly described the effect as overwhelming and incomprehensible. One German general wrote, "American squads operate with the speed of entire battalions. They move faster than our commands travel across the field. When we order counterattack, they have already shifted. When we prepare fire, they are no longer there. When we dig in, their tanks arrive instantly." The frustration grew into fear. German soldiers described feeling hunted, unable to hide, unable to reposition without being instantly struck. They had always believed that the bocage would protect them, but the radio stripped away the protection of terrain, turning every hedgerow into a trap. The Americans controlled every inch of the battlefield, not through sheer firepower, but through the coordination that unleashed that firepower at will. The SCR-300 was the heart of this control, the center of a new tactical universe where squads no longer fought alone, where every voice on the radio could bend the battlefield to its will, and where the United States Army, for the first time in history, became a single cohesive organism capable of striking with terrifying precision. In the final hours of many battles, German survivors whispered the same realization. The Americans do not fight faster than us, they think faster than us. And in a war defined by speed of action, speed of reaction, and speed of adaptation, that difference was fatal.
For the German army, the Normandy campaign began with confidence. They had faced the Americans before in North Africa and Italy, and while they respected American firepower, they believed they understood their opponent. The Germans expected boldness, determination, and a certain brute force style of attack, but they also expected something else, something they had come to rely on in every battle. They expected friction, confusion, disorder, the natural slowdowns of war. They expected to break American momentum by cutting telephone wires, by killing officers, by isolating squads inside the hedgerows. But Normandy delivered a shock. The German high command did not foresee. The Americans were not fighting like the enemy they remembered. They were fighting like something entirely new. German soldiers quickly noticed the difference. The first engagements were small encounters along narrow hedgerows at dawn. A German machine gun opened fire. The Americans dove for cover. This was familiar. But then something unfamiliar happened. Before the Germans could relocate, before they could shift fire, before the commander could give orders, artillery shells began crashing into their position. The ground erupted, the hedgerow behind them shook, and a Sherman tank appeared so quickly it seemed impossible. This pattern repeated again and again. An engagement opened, and within seconds the Americans reacted. Not in minutes, not in the slow, rhythmic pace the Germans were used to, but instantly. Captured German machine gunners described the sensation as fighting an enemy you could not surprise, one who always knew where you were. The reason was simple, but hidden from German eyes. Somewhere nearby, a single American soldier knelt behind a hedgerow, keying a handset on the SCR-300, relaying information straight into the nervous system of the United States Army. German units felt the effects long before they understood the cause. Reports flowed steadily into divisional headquarters across Normandy, and every day they grew more frantic. One particularly striking report, written by a major of the 352nd Infantry Division, read, "The enemy coordinates their infantry, tanks, artillery, and aircraft faster than we can process. Follow-up actions often occur before our first response." Translated into plain German, the Americans were moving too fast for the German command system to cope. The German army still relied on a mixture of shouted orders, runners, and wired telephones. Their radios were fewer, bulkier, and often limited to battalion or regimental leadership. When a German platoon ran into trouble, they could not simply summon help in seconds. They had to wait for communications to travel up and down the chain of command, and in Normandy, time was death. One German lieutenant wrote in his diary, "We prepare a counterattack, but before we complete the order, the Americans have already attacked us again. They seem to know exactly when we begin to move." German commanders soon realized that American squads behaved differently from any infantry they had ever fought. They were not static, they were not tied to predetermined plans. They moved like water flowing around resistance, shifting direction instantly, bending the battlefield to their advantage. A German officer used a haunting phrase in a post-battle debrief. "The American infantry behaves like liquid. Push them here and they flow there. Push them again and they flow around you." This was not normal behavior for infantry, but it was normal behavior for an army where every squad had a radio, and every radio was a doorway to artillery, armor, and air support. The first time American infantry used their radios to coordinate a rapid multi-pronged assault, German defenders at a crossroads near Saint-Lô were convinced the Americans had sent an entire battalion at them. In reality, it was a single company using SCR-300 radios to shift squads like chess pieces on a board. German commanders had no counter for this, because their own squads could not be repositioned quickly enough. By the time orders arrived, by the time the wires were repaired, or the runner returned gasping for breath, the battlefield had changed. The Americans had moved on. The flank had collapsed. Another German report from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division captured the helplessness of their situation. "Our men fight bravely, but the enemy moves faster than orders can be delivered. They're able to mass force in minutes. We require hours." Across the front, the same complaint echoed. The Americans were collapsing the German decision cycle. The Germans were always one step behind, reacting instead of acting. German intelligence officers attempted to understand the source of this speed. At first they blamed pre-planned tactics, then they suspected coded signals or hidden forward observers. Only later, when captured American equipment was examined, did they grasp the truth. The small backpack-sized SCR-300 was the key. German officers stared at the device with disbelief. A radio light enough for one soldier to carry, clear enough to cut through forest and hedgerow, strong enough to coordinate units across 3 to 5 miles, and simple enough to operate under fire. Such a device did not exist in the German army. Their infantry radios were heavy, unwieldy, prone to failure, and rarely distributed below company level. The Americans had given every squad the one thing the Germans lacked: immediate connection to the rest of the army. By the time German commanders realized this, the damage was irreversible. Once the Americans established a foothold in Normandy, their radio-driven tempo only accelerated. German units attempted to counter by fortifying positions, digging in deeper, setting ambushes, but every time they opened fire, the response came too quickly. A mortar burst here, a Sherman shell there, or artillery flattening their line entirely. The Americans were not faster in body, but in mind. They saw the battlefield sooner, decided sooner, and acted sooner, because they were connected by radios that carried decisions at the speed of speech. German generals held briefings trying to find ways to slow the Americans, but their own communication system could not match the tempo. One general famously said during a meeting in July, "We are fighting an enemy who has stolen time from us." In desperation, German units fell back hedgerow by hedgerow, village by village. Each fight beginning with confidence and ending in confusion as American squads flowed around them like a force of nature. It was not the sheer weight of American firepower that broke the German defense in Normandy. It was the ability to bring that firepower to bear with frightening speed. Each engagement lasted seconds, not minutes. Decisions that took German officers 10 minutes took American sergeants 10 seconds. And throughout the campaign, one phrase repeated in German reports: they moved as if one brain commanded 1,000 legs. The SCR-300 had done something extraordinary. It had connected the thoughts of ordinary soldiers into a single, fast-reacting organism. The Americans had not become stronger, they had become faster. And on the battlefields of Normandy, speed was a weapon more devastating than any rifle, machine gun, or tank Germany had ever built.
By the end of the Normandy campaign, German commanders finally understood the truth that had been staring at them since June. The Americans were not winning because they had more tanks or more artillery or more aircraft. They were winning because they fought at a speed Germany could not match. The SCR-300 had done something no other piece of equipment had ever accomplished. It had erased the natural delays of the battlefield, the fog, friction, and paralysis that every commander since ancient times had been forced to accept. Those delays were gone, replaced by a flow of information so constant and so rapid that the United States Army became the first truly networked force in the history of war. Every squad, every tank, every artillery battery, and every aircraft became a node in a single connected system. Once that system reached critical mass, the battlefield itself shifted. The Germans were fighting an enemy that thought faster, moved faster, and learned faster than any army before it. The implications reached far beyond Normandy. In the weeks after the breakout, American forces advanced across France with a speed that left German officers in disbelief. Armor divisions surged forward, not in rigid formations but in fluid thrusts, guided by radio updates from scouts. Infantry squads fanned out across fields, calling airstrikes and artillery at will. Engineers blew obstacles the instant they were identified, and forward observers measured distances in seconds, not minutes. Every mile the Americans advanced was shaped by the quiet crackle of SCR-300 transmissions. Information became the most lethal weapon the Americans possessed, and the Germans found themselves drowning in its consequences. German high command tried desperately to adapt. They reorganized telephone lines, they deployed more signal units, they urged commanders to improvise, but improvisation could not overcome physics. A runner could not outrun radio waves. A field telephone could not operate after a single artillery shell cut the wire. A battalion commander could not coordinate a counterattack when the Americans had already redeployed their forces twice before he even received the message. The war had shifted into a tempo only one side could sustain. The Americans began using tactics that had never existed before because, before the SCR-300, those tactics were impossible. Small units fought with independence that astonished observers. A sergeant in a hedgerow could alter the direction of an entire company by radio. A forward observer could halt a German armored assault by directing fire from multiple batteries. A squad pinned down in a village could summon tanks, aircraft, and artillery in seconds. It was warfare unshackled from the slow machinery of 20th century command. It was the beginning of real-time combat, a term no one had yet invented, but one every American soldier was practicing instinctively. The German army was built on centralized discipline and rigid hierarchical command. It excelled when its leaders had time to maneuver, when orders flowed clearly from top to bottom, when battles followed predictable rhythms. But Normandy shattered that rhythm. The Americans no longer fought according to a schedule or formation. They fought according to information.
Whenever they learned something, they acted on it. Whenever something changed, they changed too. Whenever the enemy appeared, they reacted instantly. Because the SCR-300 had collapsed the distance between decision and action. By the time German commanders realized what was happening, they had already lost the ability to seize the initiative. The Americans had stolen it permanently. This transformation was not lost on military theorists. After the war, German generals studying their defeat consistently pointed to the same factor. American communication allowed units to function at speeds that made our reactions ineffective. They did not fight with greater strength. They fought with greater coordination. The Americans themselves understood it too. In later interviews, veterans described the SCR-300 not as a tool, but as a lifeline, a way to weave the battlefield into something coherent. A rifle squad could move confidently, knowing that support was only seconds away. A tank commander could push aggressively because he knew infantry were listening. A forward observer could call down fire without waiting for permission because his voice traveled to the guns instantly. This trust created a unity no amount of training alone could replicate. The radio did not replace leadership, but it extended leadership across the entire battlefield, giving the army a single mind and countless limbs. As the war moved toward Germany, that unity became overwhelming. German officers recorded scenes of American assaults shifting direction with uncanny precision, American tanks arriving at perfect moments, and artillery falling exactly where needed with no visible observers to guide it. For the first time in history, small units became architects of the battlefield instead of merely pawns. They made decisions, shaped tactics, and influenced battles because the SCR-300 carried their voice far beyond their immediate surroundings. It was not simply that the Americans could coordinate faster, it was that they had redefined what coordination meant. They no longer acted as scattered companies, but as a single interconnected organism. That organism did not tire, did not falter, and did not wait. By the final months of the war, the impact of the SCR-300 was clear. It had become the backbone of modern combined arms warfare, a philosophy in which infantry, armor, artillery, and air power operate not as separate branches, but as one cohesive force. Future generations would refine the idea, but its birth took place not in a laboratory or a headquarters, but in the hedgerows of Normandy, in the hands of young Americans shouting into a radio while bullets cracked over their heads. The SCR-300 became the ancestor of every battlefield network to come, from the Vietnam-era radio nets to the precision-guided coordination of the Gulf War to the digital battlefields of the 21st century. The modern soldier with a headset and a tactical tablet draws a direct lineage from that 30-pound backpack carried through mud and fire by radio men who often could not see the battlefield they were shaping. They only heard it and spoke into it. But their voices traveled with a power greater than any weapon they carried. When German commanders later reflected on the strange, fluid, unstoppable enemy they had faced, many admitted the same truth. The Americans fought like one mind commanding 1,000 legs, and the SCR-300 was that mind, its signal pulsing across Normandy, turning chaos into clarity and infantry into something the world had never seen before.